here we are. Joy Sullivan, welcome to the podcast. It's good to meet you.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes, and I thought of a fun way to begin this conversation. Well, it's fun for me. Time will tell how you feel about it, but we're recording in the past, and the podcast is being published today, which is the day that your book is out. And so I just wanted to say congratulations, your book is out. And I thought the fun part was, how does it feel to have your book out? Like projecting that into the future. I thought it could be like a fun time capsule for you to listen to when it actually is out. So people are reading it, they're buying it, they're leaving you nice comments. How's that feel?
Well, that's an amazing opening question. I love it. I hope that I think if I could just like imagine the dream version of future me, it's very relieved and it just feels really at peace with how the process has gone. As an anxious person, that is like what I'm projecting into the future, that I feel really good. I feel like I've accomplished something and I just feel excited for people to read the book.
Yeah, because it's your first book, right?
It is my debut collection, which is super exciting. And it's exciting that there's people out there that are still excited to read collections of poetry and that people are still really invested in that journey that I think only poetry can give us.
Yeah, I saw the video on your Instagram of you opening the box of books and holding it for the first time. And I showed my girlfriend, and I'm like, this is what I did when I took my box to a Mexican restaurant and had a bunch of friends, and we like ate burritos and opened the box together. And I like had a moment.
Unboxing video?
Yeah.
That's amazing. I
Yeah.
was so nervous I was going to do something weird. I had to have several takes. I couldn't actually look. I just like started opening it and I was like, no, that look that you made a weird sound. And then I was like, no, your face looks weird. And then I was like, I just gotta commit to this being a little awkward and just do it. And then I finally opened it.
It's more honest that way because it is like a tender, vulnerable moment that's years in the making. And so
Totally.
I
Totally.
appreciated the realness.
Yeah, I think it's just like it's amazing to actually hold it. Like I have seen so many drafts of this thing digitally, but to open it and to experience as like a real tangible thing in the world, it really changes the experience. And it's really strange. Like I know a lot of people compare it to childbirth or like having a baby in some small way. And it does sort of feel like here's this thing that you've poured your life into that's separate from you, but is like very vulnerable also. And then the idea that lots and lots of people are going to read this is kind of a terrifying and exciting thing.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can dive in there. So the book is called Instructions for Traveling West.
Yes.
And I read how many sentences is this? Three sentences that was the start of the poem that sort of, I was going to say, gave birth to the book's idea.
Yeah.
And Joy, just to pump your tires a minute, you're one of the few writers that I follow on Instagram where routinely I will read something you've written and be like, holy shit, how'd you do that? That's so good. And those lines at the beginning, can I quote them to you?
Sure.
Okay. So it says, first, you must realize you're homesick for all the lives you're not living. Then you must commit to the road and the rising loneliness, to the sincere thrill of coming apart. And I read that and I was like, hot damn, that's fire. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the origins of traveling west, how that began, etc. Because I know you had quite a year of or two or three of break up, quit the job, sell the house, get in the car,
Mhm.
full surrender to uncertainty. Maybe we can unpack that.
Yeah, I that poem worked some really strange alchemy. You know, after you bring something into existence, it's almost like it becomes this little blueprint that I began to sort of pattern my life after. So I wrote that book mid-pandemic. It was before we had vaccines or anything else that had come out. So we were not at work. Everyone was working remotely. People were super isolating. And so I was like, why am I just hanging out in Ohio in my house? I had not traveled much in the US. I grew up overseas, but I hadn't traveled much domestically. So I just took my laptop. I was working at an agency at the time and drove out west in my Subaru. And I think we were all having, I don't know if the pandemic was like for you, but I think a lot of us were having this moment where we sort of collectively woke up to our lives and ask ourselves, like, God, like life is again really short. And I think all of us have different moments personally in which we come to that realization, that sort of personal reckoning. Are we doing what we want to do? Have we found the thing that lights us up? Do we actually make meaning in the way that we make meaning? Right. But what was so interesting about the pandemic is that we collectively, I think, had that reckoning at the same time. Even though we were all isolated and doing it individually, we were also doing it collectively. And so for me, that process, I just drove to the desert, which is always a space that I will return to in any kind of grief. The desert in the wintertime. I've done Joshua Tree in snow. I've done Sedona in February. For me, that is one of the most austere and amazing and brutal places to feel whatever you're going to feel. And so I drove myself out west and I spent a lot of time rethinking my life. And at the time I was working, upwards of 60, 70 hours a week at a corporate job. I was starting to develop really intense pain in my arms from chronic typing and chronic writing. And here I am, like, in the middle of the desert, seeing the most beautiful things. And I'm thinking about email campaigns and brand strategy and messaging maps. And there's nothing wrong with those things. But I woke up to, like, I'm doing a job that my body is literally telling me I can't continue. My surgeon was like, you could lose the ability to use your hands in the future if you don't rest your hands. And I can't, because I'm up against deadlines. And at the same time, I'm working so much and I'm seeing all these beautiful things, but all I wanted to do was just be outside. And so I came to the recognition and then wrote that poem of what instructions I would tell myself traveling west. And it was, you just got to go. You just got to reacquaint yourself with desire and all her slender hands. And, the final line in that poem, remind yourself joy is not a trick. Peak pandemic, in the middle of burnout from my job, in the middle of breakup, I was just flooded with joy. And at times I felt sort of guilty for that and had to remind myself, this is not a trick. You're allowed to feel this. So I wrote the poem, and then that truly was this alchemy that became a catalyst for the rest of the rest of my life. And so I wrote that poem in February, and then within, I think, 3 months, I had actually literally leaped west. So I had sold the house and packed up the 2 cats and all the plants and the books, and I had moved to Portland, which is where I am now. So lots more to say on that, but that kind of gets us started on the whole origin of the poem and how it started me off on this journey.
Yeah. And so you were working so hard that a medical professional said you might lose your hands, the use of your hands, and your reaction was, yeah, but I got a deadline. I've got a campaign I need to produce. That to me is such a succinct description of where you were at in life.
Yeah.
At that point, did you recognize, like, was that rock bottom, so to speak, or was that a transition point, or was that just one more thing along the way?
I think that was past the point I should have already been out, because I think when our body starts to break down, we have neglected the signals it's told us before it starts unraveling on us, if that makes sense. Like, I think by the time our body starts to break, we've already missed the warning signs. And then it's like, well, if you're not going to take a break, if you're not going to slow down, we're going to force you to slow down. And, I just remember going to this, hand surgeon, and he's like holding my hand, and it's so tender. I know it's his job, but it was like, he's like holding my hand, and it feels so tender, and he's very attractive. And I just remember being like, and he was like, you have got to slow down. And I was like, okay, I will. But I remember being like, I don't know how. And my work was understanding. They tried to give me breaks. Eventually I went part-time. There was some wiggle room there, but the lesson that I learned was this is a dead end. Like in the end, you're never going to get. It was coupled with the idea of like, all I want to do is build my life around being able to have more time to be outside and to be moving my body. And I had to reckon with myself, like, can you honor your body enough to take a little less money? Can you honor your body enough to exchange sunlight for this title that you have? And I had thought for a while, oh, if I could just get to copy director, if I could just get the highest promotion possible, then that'll give me what I really want. And I think, it's like titles aren't everything. You get there, and I kind of looked around and I saw everybody else who was on the same track, and their marriages were a mess. They had terrible health problems. They seemed deeply unhappy. I don't want to paint in broad strokes, but for me, I couldn't see a trajectory forward that promised me any kind of happiness. And I had to really ask myself, why the heck am I doing this? Right? Like, why am I doing this? I just want to be out. I want a life that I can be in the sunlight again. That would feel lucky. And so really I reshifted and remodeled my whole life around that goal, was to be outside and to move my body when I needed to.
I love that. I've written about this idea of defining success individually. And in our society, it's very much title, income, car, square footage of your home, right? It's these kind of materialistic things. But what if we define success in terms of how much you love your body, or how many waterfalls you've swam in this year, or how many hugs you got this month, or sort of an individual process. So for you, was that a conscious decision to do that? Or like, was it a conscious decision to run towards that version of life? Or was it more like, I'm in a burning building, I need to run away from this existence that I have?
I mean, I think it was both. I think that line, that says, first you must realize you're homesick for all the lives you're not living. I realized on a lot of different levels, not just physical, but also emotional, that there was a self inside me that I had this kind of spiny sense about, but I couldn't access her in the life that I had created for myself in Ohio. And I didn't have a bad life. I had a really lovely partner. I had a really lovely job. I had a really lovely house in a neighborhood that I cared about. But I had this sense, and I think a lot of us have that like little prickly sense that there's like some other thing that we might have access to. And a lot of people are like, okay, do I just need to move to Portland, from the Midwest, or do I just need to go to California? And I'm like, I know the book is called Instructions for Traveling West, but I think West can be exactly what you're saying, our own kind of personal vision of that impulse or that instinct to go where the body is telling us to go. And I think just like animals, we have instincts that propel us and move us into new spaces. And I don't know that it matters geographically where you go, but I think there was tremendous value for me in anonymity, right? In being able to leave. I mean, I moved to Portland without knowing anyone. I didn't know a soul here. And so this kind of beautiful moment of reinvention, for me, the gift was to be totally anonymous in this place and to just listen to that instinct and start over. And then, fast forward 2 years, since getting here, I have left my corporate job. I have started my own business community, my own small business, which is a writing community. And I've also gotten a book deal. So I just think, again, it's that idea of like giving yourself full permission to reinvent.
How did you end up in Portland specifically?
Yeah, I was dating a bunch of different cities, meaning I was going and spending like, a week there and seeing how it was. So I spent some time in Denver. Austin was on the list. And people kept saying, I could kind of see you in Portland. And I thought, I'm not going to Portland. I'm not doing that. Like, that's too far. And there's lots of like funny sayings like, keep Portland weird, that kind of thing. And so I wasn't sure. And then I came out here for 6 days. Sorry, I don't know if my cats are being loud. I came out here for 6 days, and I just fell in love with it. I just love the ocean. I love the mountains. As somebody who's spent a lot of time in the Midwest, I just really recognized that this was a space that specifically was going to give me access to that natural world. And there's a lot of great creatives in this city. But again, I don't know if it mattered where I went. It just mattered that I went somewhere totally new.
Yeah. As a brief aside, and I can maybe edit this out later, but have you been to Silver Falls State Park?
Yes, I
All the
have, with the
waterfalls?
I think there's 7 waterfalls.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Have you done the loop, the walk?
I have. My ex-partner took me there on our second date and kissed
Oh.
me at every single waterfall, which is great game.
That is a good game,
If
actually.
anyone needs a date idea, that's a really good one. That's free.
That is, yeah, and that's the main takeaway for people from this podcast is,
Yeah.
uh,
Seven Falls State Park. It's a loop. You
yeah,
have to kiss at every waterfall.
yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
Uh, um, follow-up question: when you moved to Portland anonymously and knew nobody, had complete freedom, what did that anonymity gift you? Like, how did that benefit you? Because
Yeah.
I could see people thinking that's terrifying. I don't know anybody. I don't blah 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 blah. There's no way I could do that. What were some of the silver linings?
Yeah, for me, it was just extremely, there's a poem actually in the book called Move to Oregon in July. That's all about, letting yourself just surrender to the tear, right? What I call the magic dark, that sort of velvety unknown that you just release yourself into. Like, it's like the fertile fecundity of the ground, right? That the seed slips into. It's dark, right? You can't plant anything directly in the sunlight as a seed. It has to first slip under into the dirt, into the darkness. And I just feel like for me, that's what it was. It was this slipping into darkness and fear, and really embracing what it was like to be all alone. But that also gave me this incredible ability to meet this other version of myself. I actually have the poem if you're interested in hearing it. It's a pretty short one.
Yeah. Yeah. Imagine if I just, as the podcast host, was like, no, I'm not interested in your poem,
You're
Joy,
like,
author and poet who came here to talk. Like, no, thanks.
yeah,
Next
actually, we're gonna
question.
pass on that.
Yeah. No, please. I would love to hear it.
Yeah, so this maybe answers the question the best way. It's called Move to Oregon in July. And you can drive to the coast and slurp oysters from the shell in cafes with tiny brass forks and fancy chilled plates. Or you can pass a lavender farm and feel the scent creep through your skin and into your dreams. Soon you'll be ordering brandy Manhattans at the bar and trying on names like Clementine or Genevieve, maybe even Ava if the bartender seems sad. A one-eared cat might follow you home. Loneliness is a bright blue dress with an open back. That's the way of it, isn't it? One day you're sitting alone at the bakery, and the next you're standing across from the ocean, and the next you're crying at the movies, and after that you're planting fruit trees and learning street names and bringing in the mail and kissing someone's delicate face. You suddenly realize you slung together something called a life. The word home drops out of your mouth like a ripe summer pear, plopping in the backyard, sticky at the edges, heavy with sweetness.
Beautiful.
Yeah, and I think to answer your question, what does that idea of giving yourself to be, I was like, literally, I can tell people a new name if I want to. I can outgrow any version of myself that has felt tired. And that was such freedom to me. I didn't end up changing my name. I had a partner that called me Clementine or Clem for a while after I wrote that poem, but it didn't stick. It didn't feel right. I decided that I wanted to keep Joy, but I think there's something beautiful about getting to say, nobody knows who I was before. Not that that was a bad person, but any version of that, any narrative there can kind of leave. And I can only be known as I am now. And I think solitude and loneliness are really important teachers. And I think we stigmatize loneliness a lot, but it teaches us and gives us the opportunity, I think, to meet a different version of ourselves when we're forced to be alone. Because instead of getting that constant feedback from other people who we are, we have to just listen to who we actually are in the silence, right? And so for me, that was just a catalyst of huge growth, because I didn't have the identity of my corporate job. I didn't have my hometown. I didn't have my partner. I just had myself in the solitude, in the desert. And I had to say, who am I here in this space? And that for me was pretty life-changing.
Yeah, it reminds me of a quote which I will butcher, but it's essentially suggesting that the problems of the world are caused by people that can't sit alone in a quiet room. Are you familiar with that?
I am, yeah.
How badly did I butcher that on a one to
No, I
10
think that's
scale?
right. I think that an ability to sit with themselves, yeah.
Okay, and then you're sitting in loneliness, and you could choose any name, you could become anybody, you have total freedom. And how did you deal with the potentiality for overwhelm? In that, I know for a lot of us, and myself included, when I could do anything, when I could be anybody, it's like this overwhelming sense of anxiety, and I don't know where to start, and I don't know what to do, and so I don't do anything. And then it's been 5 years, and I'm still in the same life, and now I'm in a shame spiral. And oh my God, Joy, what the hell? Do you have any thoughts on the overwhelm associated with total freedom?
Totally. And it's actually something I experience now too, as somebody who is an entrepreneur and a writer. I'm not married, I don't have children. I have the gift of abundant freedom, but with that, I can go any direction. And I think for me, sometimes I have paralysis around that level of freedom. And I totally know what you mean. I've struggled with that. It's like, I don't know. I could do anything. And like, even if you don't have that level of freedom, I think we all get paralyzed by choice. This idea of, I want to lead the best life, but I don't know where to go. And I'll tell you a story that really helped me frame this. And it was actually when I was on one of my solo trips, which I highly recommend solo trips to anyone, especially women. I think when you're thinking about meeting the sovereign self and getting lonely and getting still, and also proving to yourself that you're not made of glass, traveling alone in beautiful natural spaces is a great way to do it. But I was traveling, I was hiking in California, and I was lost. I'm usually lost. And I asked somebody for directions on a trail, and I said, which one's better? And she said, well, you can go up and you can see the main vista, and you can see the overlook, and that's great. But you could also go through the valley and you could see all the sunflowers. And I said, well, which one's better? And she said, either way you go, it's all heaven. And I think about that phrase so often when I am paralyzed by choice, when I'm exactly what you described, when I'm overwhelmed. Do I stay in Portland? Do I move to California? Do I move overseas? Do I write a novel next? Do I write essays next? I mean, I think with the beauty of leaping is that we've got to get ourselves off the cliff, right? But then once we start leaping, it can be really scary to know where to go. And I tell myself, it's all heaven. No matter which life you choose, it's all heaven, right? And even when, I moved to Portland, I got my car smashed in pretty quickly. There was lots of hard things. I kept repeating to myself, it's all heaven. Truly, it's all part of it. It's all heaven. This is part of it. The ache and the beauty. Either way you go, you'll experience both the highs and the lows. And that has given me a lot of comfort over the years here.
Yeah. I just love that so much. A random woman on a random hike has a random encounter with you, says something about heaven, fundamentally changes your life. You think about it all the time. And now we're on a podcast. Thousands of more people are going to think about this. And she might be out there sitting quietly, like, I've never had an impact in the world. And you're like, no, lady, you've changed so much. But you've
True.
touched on something big, which I think hinders a lot of us from taking action. It's this idea of the paradox of choice, in that there's a right choice or that there's a perfect path.
Right.
And there's a lot of analysis and unsteady thinking that prevents us from just following that little intuitive pull towards the west, to use your metaphor.
Yeah. And the idea too that if like for whatever reason we didn't get to choose the life that we wanted, and there's very real reasons for that. Not everybody has the freedom to leap all the time. I understand that for sure. And it's certainly from a place of privilege. I've gotten to do a lot of the things that I've gotten to do. Like that's just a reality. But the fact is, I leaned into this life because I didn't get the life that I wanted. The life that I wanted was, you know, at that time in my life, I wanted to be married by I was 25. I wanted to have children. And that I didn't get that life. That wasn't for that, just like didn't happen. So by the time I hit my early 30s, I was like, well, what is heaven about the life that I have? And it meant that, okay, I didn't have the kids and I didn't have the partner, but it meant that I could travel, and it meant that I could write, and it meant that I could create full time. And so I leaned into that version. And I think it's less about being paralyzed by the choice, but leaning into the life that you got full force. I feel like I spent a long time hovering and saying, well, I didn't get this, I didn't get that, I can't enjoy any of these other things. And now I've just, so many things have bloomed for me by just leaning into the things that I could make magnificent about the life that I have.
Yeah. And in dealing with the pain of the past, or how that worked out, did you like go to a therapist? Did you just sit in a monastery? Did you read some books? What helped
Uh,
you to alchemize that pain?
Well, I love therapy and have been in therapy throughout my adult life, which I'll always recommend. But truly, and I don't want to be expected here, but really writing has been so helpful for me. I mean, I can't think of any other process that literally puts you in the driver's seat of a narrative, which is, of course, a metaphor for the narrative of our own lives. So I used to work with girls who had experienced a lot of trauma. They were all survivors of human trafficking, and I would go and volunteer and do writing workshops with them. And I am such a believer in the power of writing to transform cognitive narratives that happen around who we are, how we talk about ourselves, our place in the world. And so what I witnessed with those girls was they had the ability to name themselves because they had to all use pen names because of the writing and the legalities and protection for them. But even getting to name themselves was a beautiful act in their healing journey, because these are girls who have maybe been called all kinds of things in their lives that they haven't gotten to choose. Then the power of naming their experience with all their control and autonomy, getting to use language. Girls who have not had control, girls who have not had autonomy, they on the page get to exercise that right and that freedom and that sense of sovereignness. And then, you know, dually, the ability to say what happens next on the page. And so I became really fascinated with this model of seeing girls shift into ownership of self, getting really choosy, like, you know, even where they would decide to break a line in a poem, exercising that kind of ability to choose. That's all a call back to sovereignty of self, right? And so that's something that I began to do a lot in my own work was, how do I move out of this place of grieving some of the lives that I didn't get, grieving some of the trauma that I've experienced? I can do it through the page. The page is really the safe space. And just like I saw with that poem, Instructions for Traveling West, you know, it's kind of like write in holy fear, friend, because it can change. It really can change the trajectory of your life, what you put on the page. I believe that it is that powerful, not only for people who survived horrible trauma, but for people who are also just want to change or rebuild or move on from loss.
You have a line that says, naming our desire is profound alchemy. It seems like that's what you're describing there. Does it begin with the clarity or the acceptance of what you want? Is that the starting point, or where do you
I think
begin?
so. I tell people, you know, a lot of, because I have a writing community called Sustenance of over almost 200 writers. And so we write a lot together. And a lot of people are like, well, where do I begin? And I say, you know, there's always that age old adage, which is write what you know, right? Write about the things that you understand or that contextualize your world. But I often tell my writers too, write what you wish you didn't know. What are the things that you've lost? What are the things that are hard? What are the lessons that you absolutely wish you hadn't learned in life? And on the flip side of that, I often ask my writers to think about desire. So, what is it that you're really wanting? And because I'm such a proponent in writing from the body and not the brain, where, you know, really feeling the language inside your body before you rationalize it with the logic of your head, I think getting in touch with the desire is a really natural way to drop back into your body. And, you know, even those sort of taboo, whether it's desire or rage or some of those taboo emotions that especially women don't always have access to, I think when you begin to access those and accept that they live in your body, your poems just expand, your writing expands.
Can you say more about that, please? The using the body to craft language before you use your brain to put it down on paper.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, again, I always say body, not brain, because a lot of things, the body is so smart. The body has so much. I mean, the body is communicating with us all the time, trying to get us to do different things. And a lot of times when we go to write, we rationalize things. So especially when I work with poets, they want to make sure that the line makes sense. They're thinking about the person who's reading it. They're trying to decide if the you know, if the line is pretty enough to write down. And that really gets us stuck when really I think we just need to generate without being an editor for a long time. And that's really the process of moving it through our bodies. So Ellen Bass, who's one of my favorite poets, she has a quote that says, you know, you want the reader to feel something in their body, right? When they also read your work. And you can't do that without first feeling it in your body. So a lot of times I tell people, you know, what are the sensory things that you're feeling in your body and how can you write to that? So again, you know, they always say show, don't tell. I say whisper, don't yell. You know, whisper the things that are happening inside your body and write that on the page and really stay in that bodily experience, because we've all read poetry that doesn't resonate, and it's usually because it's overly intellectualized, right? But when you write with the body, you're allowed to write from the senses, but also, you know, a lot of people use synesthesia, where your synesthesia is where your senses overlap. So some people will like, have you heard of this before? They'll like
My
see.
girlfriend has it.
Cool. What does it look like for her?
She's described it as, um, I mean, I might butcher this, but my recollection is that she would associate colors with words or
Yes.
places. Like
Yeah.
I would say a word to her, she'd be like turquoise. I'm like,
Yeah.
what?
Yeah.
And then I would test her and she would remember.
Yeah.
I'm a scientist. I'm like, what? Let me
So a lot of people, so that was categorized as actually a mental disorder for a while. And I also am a synesthetic, and my sisters are also a little bit. And you can have that kind of cross sensory overlap with a lot of different things. So some people can actually taste flavor when they hear music, or yeah, really fascinating, almost like intersections of senses happening in mismatched ways. And now they're moving out of thinking it as a disorder and more into like a creative muscle, that it actually allows us to be more creative when we're able to allow our senses to overlap. So moving back to that idea of writing from the body, it's allowing yourself to stretch into these really strange muscles. So, you know, if you want to say the sky is so blue it howled, write that. That's technically a synesthetic observation. The sky is so blue it howls, right? But making sense of how the body experiences the world, the truth of the body, versus trying to rationalize it through the brain, often really helps writers get out of this kind of stuckness or paralysis when they come to the page. So I think that that's a great place to start, of just writing the weird sensory driven experience of being in the world, and then worrying about how it sounds later.
Yeah. Like giving yourself permission to just get it out and purge and put it on a page.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I think, Brendan Constantine, another poet I really love, he says, what you write is none of your business. And I love that, because it's like we get very stuck, and we get, I can't tell you how many writers I talk to who say, I go down to write and I just hate all of it. And it doesn't matter. You don't have to like it. It's none of your business. You don't know where it's going. Your job is to sit in your body and to write what comes out, the truth of what comes out. And your job is to get in touch with your own desire and your own authentic feelings, be it rage or happiness or joy, or sorrow or grief, and to aptly name that ache, right? I also tell my writers, be a poet, not a preacher. You don't have to have any sound advice. You just have to aptly name the ache. And I think it's the naming the ache that makes poetry so powerful, not necessarily giving people any advice about it.
Can you give an example of what naming the ache might look like for people?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a line from one of my poems. I have a poem that's about, it's called When the Queen Dies, and it's about the queen bee. And it talks about, the last line says, who was the first person to tell you about your brokenness? Even so, which part did you spin into honey? And it's about, again, that idea of sort of reclamation of self. And so it's not necessarily having to intellectualize what advice she would give to someone who's feeling at a time brokenness. It's simply just extending the offer to spin whatever that is into a question, which is, now what are you going to turn into honey? So I think what's special about poetry and naming the ache is often in the generosity of a question that's turned back and offered to the reader. Because I see a lot of people trying to give advice these days. And I think we would all serve each other better if we simply ask questions or allowed them to sit with really beautiful questions.
It's almost like name the ache and then share the ache. Is that what you're alluding to?
I think so. Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's also not being afraid to say the really hard things about being human. Like, we're all very worried about being the heroes of our own work. And that just actually isn't what makes interesting poems. Like, no one wants to read a poem in which you did everything right. That's not actually very interesting. Like, I want to read the poem where you fucked up and you said that really bad thing and you had that really problematic thought. And I want to be able to experience that with you. And I think that's the vulnerability that also happens in naming the ache. Like, you're just giving language to the very real experience of being human. And that's where the relief comes from, not because I have some wisdom to impart, but just that I'm going to be generous with my experience of being human. And that in itself, I think, is redemptive versus feeling like I have to have answers. I grew up really religiously, and I have come away from that tradition. And now as a poet, I'm very resistant to try and give anyone any kind of certainty or life advice. And so it's such a relief for me to truly to be a poet, not a preacher, and just allow people to have their own interpretations about the work and their own meaning making, instead of having to feel like I have to give it answers for people.
Going back to your waterfall story about being kissed at every waterfall, and to the point you just made about poetry, imagining a poem where everything works out and it's all good and glorious, but there's something as an example that you went on that waterfall thing, got kissed at every waterfall, but it's your ex-partner versus if it was your current husband, there's almost a depth of it having not worked out despite having this romantic waterfall adventure that adds to it, that is relatable.
Totally.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think the idea is like, sometimes I don't know, sometimes I think a lot about the fact that, like, when we're thinking about being on the precipice, when we're thinking about taking a big leap, we don't do it necessarily because we think everything's going to turn out just the way we want it. We don't go on the hike and kiss at every waterfall because this is absolutely that we're guaranteed this is the person, right? We do it because we're trying to be fully present and alive to that moment. And so I've thought a lot about, like, what's the risk? Like, all these people are writing me after reading the book or reading my poems and saying, I'm leaping, I'm going to Italy for 3 months, or I just left my partner, or I just quit my job. And it's like, I think that is so beautiful. And yet we don't leap necessarily because we're promised the happy ending, right? And I have poems in my book that talk about all the partners that I left and all the engagements that I said no to. And I'm so truly grateful that those things didn't work out. I have a poem in the book that talks about, the dark bird of our love that blessed could not fly, never found its wings, and how that's like a dark gift. And so I think that there's this kind of like, you have to leap and also be prepared to be knocked about a little bit on the way down too. Like, it doesn't always equate to happy endings, and that's okay. We still do it anyway.
Yeah, I think Cheryl Strayed had that line about the ghost ship that didn't sail, something
Yeah.
like that, of like,
That
oh,
we,
it could have worked out, but it didn't because that ship's
yeah.
going that way.
Yeah.
Yep.
And all we can do, she says, is salute it from the shore, right?
Yep.
And Chinua Achebe, who's a Nigerian author who wrote Things Fall Apart, he has a really beautiful quote that says, even if we do not know how it is going to end, we still have the obligation to struggle. And he tells this really beautiful parable about a leopard that's chasing a hare. And when the leopard finally catches up with the rabbit says, let me just give me a moment. I'm just going to create a disruption in the road. I'm going to break all these branches down and drag them across the road. And the leopard says, okay, but why? And the rabbit says, because I want everyone who passes here after my death to know that here a great struggle occurred. And I think so much about, why do we do things? Why do we leap? Why do we protest? Why do we create resistance? We do that because in the end, it doesn't matter if we're successful or not. What's dignified and beautiful in that moment is to struggle, is to do the scary thing, is to leap towards the life that's calling for us.
Yeah, but it's so hard, Joy.
It is. It is. And it's disappointing. It's like I've moved out here for 2.5 years and I don't have every last thing I wanted. I didn't get everything. I still have an ex-partner here that, I love and care about very much. It has, many poems in the book about him, that he is blessed. But it is, yeah, I think it's a fool's errand to do things expecting outcome, and for the only reason that we act. I think that's actually leads to greater nihilism and despair when we try and equate every leap or every brave thing we do with this payoff. I think it's kind of a capitalistic way of thinking about how we engage with our world.
I love that. Yeah. And I'm reminded, I had this dude on the podcast named Dewey Freeman, who is like this grizzled Yoda cowboy psychotherapist. And he's amazing. But he talks about the distinction between control and power. And he talks about it as control being what you do when you don't trust, and power as being the ability to influence and be influenced. And it sounds like what you're alluding to there is stepping into power by taking the armor off and being exposed to whatever may occur. through that series of actions, the anonymity, the loneliness, the uncertainty, the great unknown. Whereas the controlling is still clinging to that old way of living you're actually trying to leave behind. And that's challenging in my experience.
Totally. But I mean, I think for me, it's like, what's scarier? The grief of, leaping and maybe not getting everything you wanted, or the grief of staying and never knowing. And that's a personal decision, and I can't say for one person, that isn't me, that they might have a different conclusion for me. But it got to the point that if I didn't go, I knew I would regret it for the rest of my life, that I didn't give myself a real shot at finding out who else I could be in this world, And like, I had a reoccurring nightmare every single night for like 8 years in Ohio, in my little blue house on the corner of Avondale. And the nightmare was that I would wake up at like 4 a.m. and I would feel like I was decomposing in a barrel of water, and I was trapped and I couldn't get out. And the day that I moved to Portland, that nightmare stopped. And I think a lot about that like, okay, this has been a really hard thing to do, but I've certainly had a lot of grief in the leap, but it is nothing compared to what it felt like to be in my body and not saying yes to the life that was calling.
Well, I'm glad you didn't title your book Decomposing in a Barrel of Water.
That's book 2.
Is it really?
No.
Like, Joy, we need to talk that. I don't know
like,
about that.
I'm not going to talk to your marketing
That's
people.
going to be very dark. So I'm curious, for those listening who just had a moment in their system when you said, I will regret this for the rest of my life, and they maybe had what my mom calls a come to Jesus moment. What advice or suggestions do you have for them to just begin the process of navigating those feelings and taking some kind of action?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think what's hard is when there's so much fear and emotionality around a leap. And usually it's happening when we're already in a point of personal distress. So I just remember like weeping on my back porch at the most stress, my hands are quitting. My job is imploding because I can't keep up with deadlines. I feel like I'm not where I'm supposed to be. I'm having nightmares, right? And so it's really tough when you're experiencing all those things at the same time to know what to do. That's where we get overwhelmed. That's where we feel like we're drowning. And so for me, I think again, not to like go back to something I've already said, but you have to create a pocket of stillness before you can even hear and feel yourself. And I think I just stopped for a week and just said, what am I going to do? Where am I going to go? And I told my job I was going down part-time. So I baby leaped. I took like a series of baby leaps. And I tell the same thing to people. You don't have to dramatically, blow everything up. You just have to take one tiny baby leap to begin to change your situation. So for me, it was starting to date a bunch of different cities. It was spending a little time in different cities. Then it was going part-time at my job so that I could get a little rest and my hands could start to heal. And then it was, deciding that I was going to move, but I still stayed remote at my job for like 6 months. And so I would say create the space where you can feel what it is that's even calling to you. So you can actually experience the ache, and then you can name it, and then take baby steps towards that, take baby leaps. And what's crazy about leaping is that it's this wild momentum. You start with one and you get a little cocky, and then you do another one, and pretty soon you're doing some really exciting things. And the other thing is when you're in that sort of energy, you attract other people who are also in that energy, and they help pull you towards where you're supposed to be. But you can't do it if you're totally overwhelmed and totally stuck and totally paralyzed. You do have to somehow create a break in that, whether it's literally taking a break, or it's finding silence, or it's going to the desert. But you do have to create a container to even know what you're being called to do. Because for years, I just had the nightmare. I didn't know that it was my body trying to tell me, you got to get out of this state and this house and this relationship. But I had to spend a lot of time with myself before I knew, oh, maybe that barrel is a metaphor that I feel deeply, deeply trapped in my life. And I've got to change something, or this is going to haunt me.
Yeah, I think that's really sound advice. I pictured somebody drowning, and then while they're drowning, you're like, hey, where do you want to go to eat? I'm like, what do you want for dinner? You're like, no. First, I need to stop drowning. I need to find a buoy or a raft or a boat or something that I could cling to. And then I can think about making a decision. But when you're in it, thrashing around, it's impossible.
Right. And you can't trust the decision either. I think there's a lot of pressure, especially, when I listen to people who are, have done inspiring things. I think there's a lot of pressure to just know what you want and go for it. And well, if we all knew what we wanted immediately, we would all do it. It's the scary part is not knowing, but that's where you just really have to sit and listen to what you want. And the thing is, we usually know, we're just tuning it out. We're too scared to look at it. I spent years in relationships that I was too scared to turn towards and say, this isn't actually what I want.
Yeah, I've had a lot of conversations with coaching clients where I just start by saying, like, what do you want? I'm like, I don't know what I want. And then I basically have to call bullshit for an hour. Like, okay, if you did know what you want, what would it? But like, we know. And to your point, that's not the hard part. The hard part is acting from that knowing or accepting it, right? Like, I've had many moments in life where I wish I didn't know that thing, or I wish I didn't feel that way. It's like, no, I don't want to be a writer. Writing's hard. I don't want to move west. That sounds like a lot. And then there's
Oh,
that
totally.
internal, yeah.
Yeah, I had that for years and years and years. And that's why I think that the nightmare manifested itself and materialized in that way. And one thing that really helped me as I was on my journey was I stopped saying, well, I'm not the kind of person. I told myself that a lot. I'm not the kind of person that moves to the West Coast. I live in Ohio on the Blue House on the corner of Avondale with my nice partner. I'm not the kind of person that leaves her partner when he's about to propose, right? I'm not that kind of person. I'm not the kind of person who has a book and writes full time and leads a writing community, right? So I had to really, for me, I just had to stop saying I'm not that kind of, I had to start saying, maybe I am that kind of person. Maybe I am the kind of person. I don't know yet. Let's find out. Maybe I am the kind of person that blows up her life at 36, and moves somewhere without knowing anyone. And then I have that again has, catapulted me into more decisions and bigger reaching. Maybe I am the kind of person, but I found it very dangerous to live in that phrase. I am not the kind of person, because who the hell of us knows what we're capable of, right? And then it goes back to the power of the narrative and the freedom of the page. You can write yourself into a new life if you can write yourself as somebody. I mean, a lot of people work in persona poetry because if they can take on a new persona, they can access some new version of themselves. And that is ultimately what I think we do when we leap, is we leap towards something that isn't even fully formed.
Yeah. And you're not that kind of person until one day you are, right?
Right. Right.
It's like, well, now you are. Guess what?
Yep. Here we are. It's just
And
that's how it worked out.
then the universe is just like, oh, cool, you made that leap. Well, here's another one. Like, oh, you went west? Guess what? You're on a sphere. You can always go wester.
I have wondered that, like, if I don't stay in Portland, like, where do I, or do I write another book as instructions for traveling south? Like, where do I go from here? But for me now, after a season of leaping, I'm really in a season of rooting. And I've been thinking a lot about that too. Like, what does it look like to really invest and to, there's a lot of courage in leaping, And then dually, after that, there's a lot of courage in letting yourself love where you are, letting yourself attach again, and letting yourself put down roots. So I think that's seasonally, that's the exercise for me is what if you let yourself love a place, you know?
Yeah, I feel seen by that. And I feel that deeply because years ago I was very nomadic and I was backpacking Africa for 4 months and I was remote working wherever I wanted to and on the
Ah,
internet and very free. And then the pandemic happened and I met a woman and I moved to Canada. And suddenly I owned uh, a couch and a TV. And everything in my system was so used to running and moving and all of that that my new edge became staying, getting a gym membership because you're going to be here a while, bro. And signing a 12-month lease gave me anxiety in my whole system. And I think to your point, that was the new challenge. That was the new, not going west. I'd done that enough, but like staying west or staying rooted.
totally.
Yeah.
And, you know, I've had to think a lot about like, okay, this is hard. You went through a breakup in Portland. That's annoying. What happens if we don't move now? You know, what happens if we sit again? You know, my therapist is really going to appreciate this that I'm saying this, but what happens if you sit with this discomfort and you don't move and blow up your life? Like what happens if you stay and find a way forward within place? And for me, west being, you know, this abstract concept is kind of nice because that can shift. I don't have to move every time I want to change something in my life, but I can still lean towards what I feel like is an instinct asking me to do something bigger and harder and a little bit scary. And sometimes that scary thing is staying, right?
Yeah. I'm just dorking out a bit that from some perspective, the instructions for heading west might mean not heading west,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like that might be the heading west. It's like, no, no, you sit here. You're not going west. Like that's actually your west. It's to
Right.
just stay and be uncomfortable.
Yeah. And, you know, I grew up overseas and moved around a lot. And I think it's like you, it became a little hardwired in my system of like, okay, every couple years we move. And as a third culture kid, about the scariest thing for me is really rooting into place, really attaching to people and to partners and to lifestyles. And so I think, you know, that's all part of the evolution is asking yourself, what is it that I'm being, what's the scary edge? Like you said, I like that phrase that I'm being called to. Where's the edge?
Yeah, and I wrote down this line from you. What happens when we heed the call of furious reinvention? It's like, whew, how's that for a journaling prompt?
Yeah.
For go for a walk with that one spinning around in your heart. Um,
Yeah.
well, I could talk to you for hours, but I feel like perhaps this is a decent place to tie a bow on it. And um, is there anything that I have not asked you that you're like, Jeremy, you moron, I wanted to talk about this. I need to say this to the world. That was your time.
No, those were so lovely. They were all such, they were things that I didn't even know I passionately wanted to talk about, and we got to talk about them. So thanks so much for the questions and the convo.
You're welcome. And to those listening, in the show notes, I'll put your website and a link to buy your debut new shiny book, Instructions for Traveling West. And I know that you have an Instagram account because I follow it. And if you're listening, you should follow it because it's fantastic. I think you're fantastic. Your writing has inspired me tremendously. I've shared it. Thank you for trusting yourself enough to head west all those years ago and for sitting with the loneliness and becoming who you are now because it's really made my life better. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
All right, Joy, we did it.
You did it.
That was good. That was fun.